right now, like as you listen to this, your heart is literally thinking.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, but it's true.
Right. And I don't mean that as like a metaphor. Inside your chest, there's this network of about 40,000 neurons, and they are operating completely independently of your brain.
Gathering emotional data, sending signals up to your head.
Exactly. Signals that actively alter how you perceive the world around you. And well, we're going to unpack that today, because we've spent previous deep dives looking up at the vastness of the cosmos and looking down at the geological formations of the Earth.
But today, we're turning our lenses entirely inward.
Exactly. Today's deep dive is strictly about the biology of living creatures.
Which is, honestly, arguably the most mysterious frontier we have. I mean, modern science estimates we share this planet with millions of other species, right?
Oh, easily millions.
And we are finding organisms thriving in, boiling hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. But at the exact same time, we are still mapping the intricate, bustling city that is our own cellular makeup.
Yeah, the microscopic stuff.
Exactly. The closer we look at the mechanics of biology, the more we realize just how unimaginably complex life truly is.
So, to explore that complexity today, we're diving into a really unique stack of sources. We're actually comparing 1,400-year-old Islamic texts, specifically the Qur'an and the Hadith, with modern biological and medical sciences.
It's a fascinating comparison.
It really is.
Yeah.
But before we get into the weeds, I want to make our mission here incredibly clear for you listening. Mm-hmm. Our sources draw these striking parallels between religious scripture and modern science, but we were simply acting as your guides to this material.
Right, we're just laying out what the texts say.
Exactly. We are impartially exploring these overlaps without taking any theological sides at all.
Right.
We're just here for the biology, the history, and honestly, the sheer wonder of the mechanisms at play.
And to really understand human biology, we first need to look at the living environments around us. The ancient texts make this really specific assertion that animals are not just isolated biological units operating randomly. The Qur'an actually states in chapter 6, verse 38, that animals are communities like you.
Which I find fascinating because historically, humans viewed animals essentially as biological automatons, like just stimulus and response machines.
Oh, absolutely. Descartes and others thought they were essentially clockwork.
Exactly. So treating them as complex, structured societies is a fairly modern scientific consensus.
It really is. Ethology, which is the scientific study of animal behavior, has fundamentally shifted how we view animal intelligence. I mean, we now observe ant colonies with highly specialized divisions of labor.
Like sanitation workers and foragers, right?
Yes. And we track elephant families that preserve deep social bonds, experience physiological trauma, and pass down geographical memories for decades.
Wow.
Even dolphins, they utilize highly coordinated hunting strategies where they communicate specific roles to corner prey. They are absolutely operating as integrated communities.
That's incredible. And the sources actually focus heavily on one particular community, the bee. And the navigation of bees absolutely blows my mind. Okay, let's unpack this. Because bees casually solve what mathematicians call the traveling salesman problem, right in midair.
Oh, the routing problem, yeah.
Right. For you listening, this is the challenge of finding the absolute shortest possible route between dozens of unpredictable locations and then returning to the start.
It's massively complex.
Right. Human engineers literally need supercomputers running complex algorithms to optimize those routes for delivery trucks. But a bee figures it out on the fly.
And they do this with a brain smaller than a sesame seed.
Which is just nuts.
It is, but the mechanism behind it is incredible. They don't just wander around hoping to find flowers. They navigate using something called optic flow.
Optic flow.
Yeah. As they fly, they measure the rate at which visual textures move across their compound eyes to gauge exact distances. And furthermore, they are constantly calculating the angle of the sun, adjusting for the time of day to orient themselves.
Wait. If their brain is that small, how do they have the computational power to process visual data, solar angles, and spatial mapping simultaneously?
Well, it comes down to neural efficiency. A bee's brain doesn't have the billions of neurons we do, but the neurons it does have are highly optimized for very specific tasks.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and when a forager bee returns to the hive, it performs this highly specific symbolic movement known as the waggle dance.
Oh, right, the dance.
Exactly. The angle of the dance in relation to gravity tells the other bees the exact angle to fly relative to the sun, and the duration of the waggle indicates the exact distance. It is literally a direct transfer of coordinate accurate data.
The biological efficiency there is staggering. I mean, it's the equivalent of a human flying between countries without a map or GPS and flawlessly finding their way home. They bypass conscious calculation and operate on, like, mathematically perfect instinct.
And scientists are actually studying this right now to improve artificial intelligence algorithms.
Which makes perfect sense. And I think that efficiency is a great bridge to the next concept in the sources, because the bee's mathematical efficiency extends directly to the biochemical efficiency of the product it makes, honey.
Yes, the texts describe honey as a drink of varying colors that contains healing for mankind.
And for centuries, people just consumed it knowing it made them feel better.
Right, but modern nutritional science reveals the actual mechanisms of that healing. Honey is this dense nutritional powerhouse. It contains B vitamins, essential minerals like magnesium and zinc, and powerful antioxidants like pinosembrin.
Let's get into the mechanics of that. What does an antioxidant like pinosembrin actually do in the human body?
So it actively reduces oxidative stress. At a cellular level, your body produces these unstable molecules called free radicals as a byproduct of turning food into energy.
Okay.
And these free radicals, they just bounce around and damage your cells. Antioxidants like pinosembrin act like biochemical sponges. They neutralize those free radicals before they can cause cellular damage.
That's amazing.
And furthermore, because of its specific free sugar molecules, honey diffuses into the human bloodstream in just 7 minutes. It provides almost immediate glucose to the brain.
Wow, 7 minutes. And the sources also point to its use in wound healing, right? Which I know is super common in modern hospital burn wards. I read that honey creates an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. But how does a sugar syrup physically kill bacteria?
It does it through a process called osmosis.
Okay.
Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it has an incredibly low water content but highly concentrated sugars. So when bacteria come into contact with honey, the sheer density of the sugar literally draws the water out of the bacterial cells.
Oh, wow. So it pulls the moisture right out.
Exactly. It dehydrates the bacteria to death. Combined with honey's naturally acidic pH, which suppresses bacterial reproduction, it acts as a highly effective, painless antibacterial agent that simultaneously provides a moist environment for new human tissue to generate.
Well, if a natural substance like honey can facilitate the regeneration of human tissue, it begs the question, how does that tissue actually begin forming in the very first place?
Right, moving from regeneration to creation.
Yeah, the sources move from cell regeneration to cell creation, specifically looking at embryology.
They do, and the ancient texts use a very specific Arabic word to describe the early human embryo. Alaka. Yeah, and the single word translates to 3 distinct things: a leech, a blood clot, and something suspended.
Okay, I have to stop you there because comparing a human fetus to a leech sounds like a massive biological stretch. A leech is a parasite. Is that actually anatomically accurate?
Actually, biologically speaking, it is a remarkably precise analogy.
Really?
Yeah. In the earliest stages of prenatal development, the embryo survives by tapping into the mother's cardiovascular system. It develops these tiny finger-like projections called chorionic villi that embed into the uterine wall.
Oh, I've heard of those.
Right. And these villi extract nutrients and oxygen from the maternal blood, functionally mimicking the exact extraction mechanism of a leech.
So it is essentially a parasitic relationship early on. Okay, what about the other 2 meanings? The blood clot and the suspension.
Well, during the first few weeks, the embryo's cardiovascular system is forming, but the blood does not actually circulate yet. It remains pooled and stationary. So if you were to look at an embryo at this exact stage, it physically resembles a coagulated clot of blood.
Okay, that makes sense.
And as for suspension, the embryo doesn't just sit in the uterus. It is physically suspended in the chorionic cavity, anchored to the uterine wall strictly by the placenta and the umbilical cord.
The level of anatomical precision there is just wild. I mean, challenge yourself as a listener to consider the specificity here. It's easy to look back at ancient texts and find vague overlaps, right?
Sure, people do it all the time.
But comparing a microscopic embryo to a leech extracting nutrients, or knowing the blood doesn't circulate yet, these are highly specific, microscopic biological mechanisms that couldn't possibly be observed with the naked eye.
No, they couldn't. And actually, Dr. Keith L. Moore, who is a globally recognized authority in embryology and anatomy, reviewed these specific descriptions.
Oh, really?
Yes. He went on record validating the correlations, stating that this specific sequence of microscopic embryonic development was completely unknown to science 14 centuries ago.
Wow.
And just to add another layer, the sources also explicitly state that every living thing is made of water. Fast forward to modern cytology, and we understand that cell cytoplasm is roughly 80% water.
So the fundamental medium for all biochemical reactions in living creatures is exactly as described.
Exactly.
So we start as this suspended, leech-like cluster of cells made mostly of water, and we build this incredible biological machine. But once the human body is formed, how does the operating system work?
That's the big question.
Right, like how do we process abstract concepts like morality or, say, choose to deceive someone?
Well, the texts introduce a concept called the naseya, which translates to the forelock, or the very front part of the head.
Okay.
The Qur'an contains a passage describing a lying, sinful forelock.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because modern neuroscience points directly to the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain sitting right behind the forehead. The texts are essentially calling the forehead the human brain's morality steering wheel.
And modern neuroscientific research backs that up completely.
Does it?
Oh yeah. The act of deception is highly cognitively demanding. Telling the truth is your brain's baseline. But to lie, your brain has to construct a false narrative, hold it in working memory, and actively suppress the truth. All of that heavy lifting occurs precisely in the prefrontal cortex.
But what does that look like physically in the brain? Like, does lying actually change the structure?
It actually does. Studies mapping the brains of pathological liars show a 22 to 26% increase in prefrontal cortex volume, specifically the white matter, compared to average people.
Wait, they have more white matter?
Yes. White matter is essentially the brain's wiring. Because they are constantly building false realities, they literally build more neural wiring in that specific front region of the brain.
That is wild.
And when subjects are put in functional MRI machines and asked to lie, the scans show massive blood flow and oxygen spikes right there in the forelock.
That is fascinating. So the physical location of deception matches the ancient description perfectly. But earlier in the intro, you mentioned that the brain isn't the only organ doing the thinking.
What's fascinating here is that the brain isn't the only thinking organ. The sources mention hearts which can think and reason in Qur'an 22.46.
Which goes against everything we're taught, right?
Yeah, exactly. For most of modern medical history, the heart was viewed strictly as a mechanical pump. Its only job was pushing blood. But there is a medical field called neurocardiology, which was conceptualized in 1991 based on research from the Lacey's in the 1960s.
Okay.
And it reveals a completely different reality. Scientists discovered that the heart has an intrinsic cardiac nervous system. It possesses a literal heart brain made of about 40,000 neurons.
Wait, I really struggle to wrap my head around this. We're taught from day one that muscles contract and brains think. How can a network of neurons inside a pumping muscle actually reason?
Because these 40,000 neurons are not just taking orders from the skull, they form a complex neural network that operates independently.
Really?
Yeah, they communicate with the brain primarily through the vagus nerve, and here's the stunning part. 80 to 90% of the nerve fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent, meaning they carry information from the cardiovascular system to the brain, not the other way around.
Wait, so the heart is sending more intel up to headquarters than headquarters is sending down to the heart?
That's exactly.
What kind of intel is it sending?
The heart's neural network sends signals directly to the brain's amygdala, which processes fear and emotion, and the thalamus, which synchronizes cortical function.
Okay, wow.
This means the rhythmic patterns of your heart are actively dictating how your brain perceives a threat, processes an emotional response, and makes a decision.
That is unbelievable.
Plus, the heart manufactures and secretes its own hormones, including oxytocin, the love and bonding hormone. So when ancient texts describe a heart that reasons, they are mapping out a physiological reality where the heart actively shapes human consciousness.
So the body isn't a top-down dictatorship ruled by the skull. It is a constant two-way conversation. But, managing all of this, the bee-like navigation of spatial awareness, tissue regeneration, prefrontal cortex processing, and a thinking heart, that requires massive amounts of energy. The wear and tear on this biological machine must be immense.
It is immense, which is why the machine requires dedicated mechanisms to power down and clear out cellular waste.
Right. Sleep, hygiene, fasting.
Exactly. And the first mechanism is sleep. The sources highlight an intriguing physiological detail through the story of the people of the cave, a group described in the Qur'an as sleeping for 300 years.
Okay.
The text explicitly mentions that a seal was placed upon their ears to allow them to remain asleep.
Why specifically the ears, though? Like, why not a seal over their eyes or their minds?
Because modern sleep science confirms that hearing is the only sensory function that remains highly active and vigilant while we sleep.
Oh, right.
Your vision shuts down entirely, your tactile senses dull significantly, but your hearing is always on alert. It is an evolutionary defense mechanism.
Which is exactly why alarm clocks work.
Precisely. If a human were to achieve a perfectly uninterrupted state of deep sleep for an extended period, the auditory processing would literally have to be suppressed or sealed.
That's a crazy detail. And the text also notes that these sleeping individuals were constantly turned from side to side, right?
Right. And this touches on modern medicine's understanding of the ischemic cascade. Ischemia. When a human body lies in one position for too long, the physical weight of the body compresses the blood vessels against the bone.
Ouch.
Yeah, this stops the blood flow. Without oxygen, the cells resort to anaerobic metabolism, lactic acid builds up, and the tissue quickly dies, forming pressure sores or bed sores.
So turning them prevents that.
Exactly. The ancient text specifically outlining the turning of the bodies perfectly describes the foundational nursing practice required to prevent tissue necrosis.
And the sources also emphasize a specific type of waking rest called the qailula, right? The midday nap.
Yes. The qailula is heavily prescribed, but it is strictly defined as a short nap, generally 20 to 30 minutes, right in the middle of the day.
Which perfectly aligns with modern circadian biology. Like a 20 to 30 minute nap is the absolute sweet spot.
It really is.
Because if you sleep longer, you enter deep slow wave sleep and wake up with sleep inertia, feeling super groggy. But a short nap physically clears out sleep debt, boosts serotonin and dopamine, and lowers cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And it does all that without disrupting your nighttime rhythm.
Exactly. And maintaining the biological machine also extends to physical hygiene. The sources outline 10 natural acts of cleanliness known as the Sunan al-Fitra.
What are those?
They include things like regularly trimming the nails and the mustache and removing body hair.
And it also includes the strict rule of eating with the right hand and cleaning yourself after the bathroom with the left hand, right?
Yes, that's a major one.
Today, that is just basic microbiology. Separating the hand that handles your food from the hand that handles your microbiome prevents cross-contamination. It physically stops deadly bacteria like E. coli from spreading.
Absolutely. But perhaps the most profound maintenance tool discussed in the texts is fasting. The Prophet Muhammad referred to fasting as the zakat, meaning the purification or charity of the body.
Which, historically, people viewed purely as a spiritual discipline.
Right. But modern cellular biology has revealed the physical mechanism of this purification. It's called autophagy.
Okay, let's talk about autophagy because this fundamentally changes how we view hunger. What exactly is it?
So in 2016, a Japanese scientist named Yoshinori Osumi actually won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for unraveling this exact mechanism. The word autophagy literally means self-eating.
Self-eating sounds intense.
It is. When you deprive the human body of external calories for extended periods through fasting, the cells do not just shut down, they go into a state of highly efficient scavenging.
But how does a cell eat itself without just dying?
It uses specialized structures called lysosomes, which act essentially as cellular incinerators. During a fast, the cell searches for misfolded proteins, damaged organelles, and accumulated toxins.
Okay.
The lysosomes engulf this microscopic trash, dismantle the molecular bonds, and burn the resulting amino acids for fuel.
So what does this all mean? I picture it like a city under a severe siege. When the supply trucks stop bringing food into the city, the inhabitants don't just sit there. They start dismantling the abandoned, broken-down buildings, using the bricks to reinforce the walls, and burning the scrap wood to keep the power grid running.
That is exactly what is happening. The cell is surviving by cleaning house. And on top of this, the metabolic stress of fasting triggers the production of something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
What did BDNF do?
It acts like fertilizer for the brain. It promotes the survival of existing nerve cells and encourages the growth of new ones. Modern science shows high BDNF levels are directly linked to combating depression and improving cognitive function.
Wow.
So the purification mentioned in the text is a literal physiological dismantling of biological waste.
Think about what that actually means. We so often treat fasting or sleeping like a simple software reboot for our bodies, like putting a computer to sleep. But it's actually a physical hardware cleaning crew taking out the cellular trash while you just go about your day.
It is a flawless system of self-preservation and efficiency written directly into our biology.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up today's deep dive, take a moment to consider the sheer complexity of the living creatures we have explored for you today. From the mathematical genius of the tiny bee calculating solar angles to the highly specific leech-like origins of your own life in the womb.
And the 40,000 neurons.
Exactly. Right now, there are 40,000 neurons firing inside your heart muscle, actively shaping your reality.
And, as beautifully as the biological machine operates, there is one final, hauntingly biological thought from the source material. Yeah, regarding how it eventually powers down.
Yeah.
We've talked about how life operates, but the ancient texts also describe the exact physiological process of death. The Qur'an specifically mentions the moment of death as the soul reaching the throat.
Which, sounds highly poetic until you map it to the clinical reality of dying.
Exactly. When a human body begins to definitively shut down, the brainstem loses control over our autonomous functions in a highly specific, predictable sequence. One of the very final clinical indicators that the brain is shutting down organ control is the loss of the glossopharyngeal nerve function.
And what does that nerve do?
It controls the swallowing reflex, located right there in the throat. This is followed almost immediately by the loss of the pupillary light reflex in the eyes.
Wow. So the absolute end of life is physically marked by the failure of these silent autonomous reflexes that we rely on every single second but never even give a second thought to.
It's profound.
Yeah.
And it leaves you with an important question to ponder.
What's that?
If the boundary between life and death is defined by the quiet shutdown of invisible reflexes in your throat and your eyes, what other microscopic, invisible processes are quietly dictating your existence right now without you even noticing?